Hello everybody. Today we're going to show you how to make bases for your railroad figures using epoxy resin. So when we first set up our G-scale railroad outside, we bought a whole bunch of figures to go with the little village that we created. But we noticed right off the bat that the figures don't stand very well. As a matter of fact, our test subjects today are going to be these Preiser Bavarian bear garden figures. And you'll notice here that there's no base under the feet. And you can stand them and balance them, but they don't really stand very well. So we wanted to create bases where they would stand nicely without worrying about, being knocked over and so forth out in the weather. So we have an example here of one of our woodcutters. And this is one with an epoxy resin base that we put on there. So you put him down, and he'll stay up in any kind of wind or weather. So we're going to show you how we create these bases today. Okay, so let's start off by telling you what you're going to need for this project. So the most important thing obviously is the epoxy resin, and this comes in a 2-bottle kit usually. So it comes with the epoxy resin itself, which is in this case is marked A, and then we have epoxy hardener, which is marked B. And you can buy these on Amazon, or you can buy them at craft stores like Michael's, and you can buy them in different quantities. We use quite a bit of epoxy resin for not only these railroad figures, but other stuff. We usually buy it in these larger containers. The next thing you're going to need are graduated containers. I don't know if you'll be able to see that through my fingers or not, but again, we bought these off of Amazon, and these are cups that are marked for measurements, okay? And we'll be using the ounce measurements today. So we have 2 cups here because we're going to measure out the right amount of epoxy resin in 1 cup, and then the hardener in the other cup, and then we'll mix one into the other. The next thing you're going to need are some kind of molds, okay, to pour your epoxy resin into along with your figure. We did try a couple of different techniques, including just setting the figure in one of these just shallow silicone molds here, and then just kind of puddle the epoxy around it, but those came out really thin. The epoxy spread out too far, so we decided to go another route with this, and we bought what Amazon would call candy molds. Okay, so these are silicone molds. They're called candy molds. I think, to pour chocolate in or whatever. And so you've got this little disc-shaped one here that we used actually for that base right there. And this different shape mold, which we would typically use for things like animals. So the front pair of feet would go into one, rear pair of feet would go into the other. And so we'll be using both of these today for a couple of things. So what we're going to do, besides this, you definitely need gloves. This epoxy resin is super sticky and tacky, so you're definitely going to want gloves. We have these little wood blocks over here so that when we set our figures in there, we'll keep them propped up, at the right angle by, with those blocks there to hold them up to keep them standing. And then you're going to need stirring sticks for your epoxy resin. Once you mix the resin into the hardener, or the hardener into the resin, you'll need a stick to stir that up. And of course, you'll need some figures to set into the epoxy resin. Okay, so now that you know what you need, let's get started. Okay, so to start the project off, we're going to mix our epoxy resin, and we'll do this by pouring 2 ounces of epoxy resin into 1 cup, pour 2 ounces of epoxy hardener into the 2nd cup, and then we'll pour the hardener cup into the resin cup. So the one thing about the epoxy resin, as Evan's mixing here, is that it can be fairly unforgiving as far as getting your ratios off. So it really has to be as close to a 1-to-1 as you can. If it's if it's off, the resin won't harden completely, and it'll stay tacky. We've had that happen before. So he's got 2 ounces of the hardener in there. Now he'll do 2 ounces. Now the resin itself is thicker, so it has a different pour to it. So he'll be really careful as far as making sure he just gets 2 ounces in there. And that's the other reason we poured into 2 cups. If we were to pour all 4 ounces into 1 cup, 2 ounces and then another 2 ounces on top of that, if one of those are off, then you really don't know which one was off. So by pouring into 2 separate cups, you can make any of the corrections or adjustments that you need. All right, how does that look? That looks like it's about 2 ounces. Okay, if you're a little tiny bit off, it's forgiving to that degree, but if it's way off, it won't harden right. So now he's going to pour the hardener into the resin. And he's going to get as much of that hardener out of there. So he's going to scrape the side of the cups to make sure he gets every bit, just to keep that ratio 1-to-1. And then once both materials are in the same cup, just stir it up. Now, one thing about epoxy resin is that it gets bubbles in it as you stir it. And if you were making a big project, like say you were epoxying like a bar top or a tabletop or something like that, you definitely want to minimize the bubbles that are in it. But this is such a small project. We have a little trick to get the bubbles out of the epoxy that works on small projects. So what he's going to do is, as you're stirring, the mixture will form kind of a cloudy substance, and he's just going to stir that until you can lower your hand and he's going to stir that until that mixture gets clearer again. And if it has a few bubbles in it, that's fine. If you're going to do it time-wise, you would probably stir it for about 5 minutes. Okay, as we finish up our stirring here, let's take a look in the cup. Okay, so that looks cloudy only because there's a lot of bubbles in it. If you were to kind of see past the bubbles, you can see that it's kind of stirred clear again if you look through. So that's pretty good right there. The next thing we're going to do is grab our molds. Okay, so now that we have our epoxy mixture all mixed up, it's time to put the figures into the molds. So we're going to use our circular mold here first, and we're going to pour a little bit of epoxy into 2 of the molds because we're doing 2 figures here. You don't have to go too thick, but if you go too thin, the epoxy will tend to bend in the sun out, on a hot 90-degree day. Really thin epoxy will actually get a little bit pliable. As a matter of fact, we're going to fix a couple of our figures so that happens to them. We're going to add a little epoxy to their base. So now that Evan has a little bit in here, what we're going to do is pop in our figures. And you can see here, we didn't really quite bury the feet. The feet are planted in the epoxy, but they're not completely submerged in there. So now we'll put our wood here. Okay, and we'll just check and just make sure that they're not leaning too forward, too far back. We want them standing natural, as if they were firmly on their feet. Yeah, so they're standing up pretty straight. Now that epoxy has a little bit of, let's zoom in, and if you can see, some of the epoxy has a little bit of bubbling in there. And we want to get rid of those bubbles because we want that epoxy to be as transparent as possible. So there's a trick for that. And if you take a heat gun and kind of go over the epoxy, it will actually pop all the bubbles. Now you don't want to burn the epoxy. You don't want to really get right up too close to it. You want to watch those bubbles burst a little bit. And they will. You'll see that when we pull those out of the mold, those bubbles clear right up when you apply a little bit of heat to them. Okay, so I said that we had to do a minor, I wouldn't call it a repair exactly, but we have to add some epoxy to a stand that we did previously, or to a base we did previously. So if you look at this figure right here, this is one of our recreational area figures here. You'll see how thin that base is that we poured. This is one where we actually just stood the figure into the mold and just kind of poured a puddle around, but the puddle spread out and it was really thin. So in the sun, this base gets really pliable. As a matter of fact, you can see it's kind of pliable now. It should be a little bit more rigid than that. And these figures tend to fall over outside even with the base. So we're going to put these in the mold and we're just going to add a little epoxy to them. And these will stand up on their own because they already have a base. We won't need to put any wood down there. Actually, maybe we should pour some epoxy in there and get a little... Nice thing about epoxy is that you can actually take a dried epoxy project, and if you need to add epoxy to it, you can do that. You don't need to remove any of the old epoxy from the original base. So there we go there. Let's get some of those bubbles out of there. And we'll pop those in. Okay, so once you have your figures in the molds, the epoxy poured, the bubbles worked out, and they're positioned correctly, it will take about 24 hours for this epoxy to set. So we have a couple more things that we want to epoxy, so we'll do those and then we'll check the whole project out tomorrow. See you then. Okay, so it's been about 24 hours since we put our figures in the epoxy resin, and so it should be dry now, but in order to test that out, just touch one of the bases there, and just make sure that there's no tackiness to it. It's completely dry and hard, and then you're all set to go. So the first thing we'll do is just move our little blocks that are holding some of the figures in place. And once those are out, then we can start peeling them away from the mold. It's a pretty easy process to do that. You just kind of peel them out. Those silicone molds, you know, the epoxy doesn't really stick to those, so they pretty much come right out. Yep, so we'll take a look at that. You can see how those, once you hold it from a couple different angles there, from the bottom, you know, top. Now the nice thing about them being clear is that whatever you set them on, the color of that texture will show through, kind of somewhat hiding the base a little bit, of making it a little less obvious. So if you set the figure on like a gray, you know, like a stone base or something like that, the gray will show through, making it a little less obvious. So why don't we go ahead and take the rest of those out. Now for these square ones here, for these green ones, the two figures in here are actually Bachmann engineers from our Grizzly Flats Bachmann engine. And you know, those figures definitely don't stand up, especially when they're in the engine. So we put those in the square molds there, and those should slide right into the engine cab. One of the things you can do if you find that your base is too thick, or if if there's too much base, you can also use a sander. Like we have a little benchtop belt sander and disc sander, and you can use that to shape your epoxy resin base as you see fit. The epoxy resin is very sandable, so you can definitely shape those up. Okay, so just to put the figures in some kind of context, here we have our Pico beer garden and our beer garden figures. So we have people at the picnic tables, and then we have our new figures that we just put our bases on. And you can see they stand up quite nice. Another use for the epoxy resin is, if you can see the pole over here on the right. Let's bring that over. You can see this one here has an epoxy base on it too. The way it came with the kit was that it was just had these kind of cross planks right here, and that just didn't stand up when it was outside in the garden. So we took one of our round molds and just put the base in some epoxy resin. And if Evan sits it back there, you can see it stands up quite nice, and that just won't fall over, even in the wind, the rain, that type of thing. Let me give you a higher view here. Yep. All right. Okay, so for our Bachmann engineers that we put in the square mold, the idea here was that they would slide right into the back of the engine there. But as you can see, I think you can see, I hope maybe the light's in there, maybe it isn't, but there's two like faux steel pieces that run down from the boiler down to the floor. And they cut the width of the floor there on the cab a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of these engineers here, and we're going to go sand just one side down and just cut the width of this base down so the slides in a little bit easier. So as I said earlier, epoxy resin is super easy to sand, so let's do that. All right. Looks like we're successful. So the engineer now will sit in the back of the cab, nice and flat. Yeah, so that'll work out as a good base. These Bachmann engineer figures also came with these little shovels, one for the firemen. We got two of them, and they both basically are the same figure. With the same hands, and they'll hold the shovel. So we'll figure out what to do with the other guy. We'll take a look at the tender and see if there's a nice place that we can get him to stand, and go from there. Okay, so there you have it. We have our two beer garden figures set in an epoxy resin base, and we have our fireman and engineer for our Grizzly Flats locomotive set in epoxy so that they'll stand in the engine nice. So just one final word is that these epoxy bases might not be for everybody. So I think that different model railroaders, probably have different standards of realism. And so maybe a figure sitting on a base, just might not be realistic looking. This works for us. We just like the low maintenance of not walking out into the garden railroad and having to reset up figures, after wind or rain or whatever. So this works for us. If you want to try this, these figures are expensive. So those beer garden figures were probably, $35. So I would try, if you want to try this, but you're not sure, I would just try it on one figure and just see how you like it. I don't want to be, I don't want our advice to be responsible for people not being happy, with the outcome with expensive figures. So use your judgment. This works for us. This is a method that I think is a pretty reliable way of making your figure stand. So, it's up to you. So anyway, so that's it, and we'll see you in the next one.